Hey guys, today we're going to be considering the menstrual cycle and learning about the details of that cycle. Before we get started though, please take out your understandings and pause this video and read understanding 6.6.8. Think about what things do you already know and what questions do you have, and please make sure that those get either answered by this video or answered in class. The menstrual cycle is a cycle that happens on a 28-day cycle, and it happens in women who are of reproductive age. And basically the goal of this cycle is to prepare an egg for fertilization and to make it available to fertilization. This cycle is controlled by a number of hormones, and first of all we're just going to go over each hormone and kind of what its job is, and then we'll put them all together in the cycle. So starting with our two pituitary hormones. Remember, the pituitary gland is located near the brain, so these two hormones are secreted by the pituitary gland and work within this process. So the first is called follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, and this hormone is going to bind on receptors on the membrane of follicle cells. And follicle cells are the cells of, it's basically a protective casing around the developing egg. And so this hormone is going to bind to those cells, and it's going to cause a few things. So FSH causes the development of the egg within the follicle. It causes a thickening of the follicle wall, secretion of the follicular fluid, which will aid in egg development, and it will also cause the follicle wall itself to begin secreting estrogen, which is another hormone that we're going to see in just a second. The second hormone produced by the pituitary gland is called luteinizing hormone, and we'll abbreviate that LH. Luteinizing hormone stimulates the completion of meiosis by the egg. And remember, meiosis is a process that produces what's called a haploid cell. It has half of the normal number of chromosomes for a human cell, so that when it fuses with the sperm, the offspring will have a complete set of chromosomes. It also causes partial digestion of the follicle wall. So remember, the follicle is basically a protective covering around the egg that's being developed, and partial digestion of this wall will then cause the wall to eventually burst, releasing the egg in a process called ovulation. Luteinizing hormone lastly causes the empty follicle to develop into what's called the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum will then become a hormone producing item secreting both estrogen and progesterone. Okay, then we go to what's called our ovarian hormones, and we've actually already heard about these two. They're called estrogen and progesterone, and they are absorbed by cells, and they influence gene expression and will therefore influence fetal development. And so let me go through each of these hormones and let you know what each one is for specifically. Estrogen causes the thickening of the endometrium. Now, the endometrium is a vascularized layer that lines the inside of the uterus. And so this layer, like I said, it's vascularized. It has a lot of blood flow and availability there. It also is going to encourage and increase blood vessel growth in the endometrium. It will increase FSH receptors in the follicle, and it will inhibit FSH secretion and stimulate LH secretion when the estrogen levels are high. Okay, so it's doing a lot of different jobs, and if you're getting confused right now, don't worry, we're going to go over this whole thing again and put it all together in a process. The second ovarian hormone that we need to know about is called progesterone. Progesterone has a couple of jobs. The first is that it maintains the thickening of the endometrium. So remember, estrogen kind of got that started. Now progesterone is going to continue that so that that endometrium will continue to stay thick and to vascularize. And then progesterone will also inhibit FSH and LH secretion. So puberty is going to be the first kind of the phase that triggers the hypothalamus to get the pituitary gland started in its release of FSH and LH, which will then enhance the secretion of these sex hormones, estrogen and progesterone, as well as testosterone in males. Okay, so let's put this all together then into our process. We're going to go step by step, and we're going to start with the point at which someone has just finished their menstrual period, so immediately following bleeding. Okay, so at this point, FSH is going to begin to be secreted by the pituitary gland. So bleeding just ceased, and FSH is going to be secreted. So this secretion will stimulate the development of several eggs in the ovaries. These eggs that are starting to develop are called primary follicles. They are in the beginning stages of development. The developing follicles will then begin to secrete estrogen. And remember, estrogen is one of our important ovarian hormones. Estrogen is going to stimulate the buildup of the uterine lining or the endometrium, like we talked about before. This is important because the endometrium is going to supply any developing fetus. So if the egg should become fertilized, it will become lodged in the endometrium, and the endometrium, remember, is highly vascularized, and so that blood supply will supply the developing fetus. In addition to the follicles secreting estrogen, this estrogen secretion will begin to inhibit the secretion of FSH. And this is important as well, because if FSH were to continue to be secreted, more and more egg cells would begin to develop, and that's not appropriate, because keep in mind, women have only so many eggs, and so you don't want to develop more than you can use. So FSH inhibits the development of primary follicles, and the estrogen causes that inhibition. All right, estrogen is going to production. It's going to continue until it reaches its peak. At this point, it's going to stimulate the release of LH. Remember, another pituitary gland or hormone. The LH will partially digest the follicle wall to aid in ovulation. And remember that digestion of the follicle wall is basically going to break open the follicle wall, allowing the egg cell to be released. Once the egg cell is released and ovulation has occurred, the LH will also stimulate the conversion of the empty follicle into what's called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum, which is basically the empty follicle, then starts its hormone-producing stage, and it's going to secrete progesterone. Progesterone will cause the endometrium buildup to continue, and remember, that's important in case the egg becomes fertilized. And it's also going to then inhibit the secretion of LH because the corpus luteum has been formed, ovulation has happened, and there's no more need for LH. At this point, both FSH and LH levels are low, and at this point, the corpus luteum will then break down. When the corpus luteum breaks down, this will also take the estrogen and progesterone levels to very, very low amounts. And when all four of these hormones are low, the endometrium will no longer be maintained. And so just a side note, this is only going to occur, this low hormone level, if the egg was not fertilized. Okay? And so with the low hormones, the endometrium is no longer maintained, and is therefore lost through the vagina. And so this is the bleeding that occurs during a menstrual period. It's actually the loss of that highly vascularized layer that was surrounding the uterus. The egg is also going to be lost through the vagina at this point. Now, low levels of all of these hormones, specifically in this case progesterone, will then stimulate the secretion of FSH, and this cycle will start all over again. The cycle from start to finish takes approximately 28 days. Okay, so I have gone through the process of the menstrual cycle in the case where the egg is not fertilized. Now, the other option is that the egg does become fertilized, and in that case, the developing embryo will actually become an endocrine gland itself and will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone to maintain the corpus luteum, which will also be secreting estrogen. And this is important because estrogen and progesterone secretion is going to maintain the endometrium, which, remember, I said was important when it's called the blastocyst, the fertilized egg, implants into the endometrium, and all of that blood supply is going to supply the nutrients and energy and everything else that blastocyst needs to develop into a fetus. It's going to be maintained for the first 16 weeks, and at this point the fetus is developed enough and the placenta has formed, and the placenta will then take over as the endocrine function, and it will continue to secrete estrogen and progesterone, not only to maintain the endometrium, but also to prevent further ovulation, because if fertilization has happened, ovulation isn't needed. Okay, lastly, here is a diagram that summarizes the whole menstrual cycle and kind of what's happening with a lot of different things. And I'm sorry, my sound icon got caught in the screenshot. But what we have here is we have basically our 28-day cycle. We start with just after bleeding like we saw before. So here is the endometrium, and this diagram is indicating the thickness of the endometrium. And so it's very, very low now, and we see the buildup over time and then the eventual loss. At the top here we've got the ovarian cycle. So here we've got our primary follicle developing, our egg being released during ovulation, and then conversion to the corpus luteum and eventual breakdown of that corpus luteum. And then lastly, we do see the levels of each of our hormones as we go through the month and how they relate to one another. So take a moment with this diagram and be sure that you understand what's going on in each case. And if not, please write down questions. Thanks.